Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Madeline Fitzgerald, and I am the manager of adult programs here at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. On behalf of the museum, I would first like to thank all of the members who are in the audience this evening. It is because of your generosity that our collection and special exhibitions are free and open to everyone. Yes. I would like to acknowledge that the Carter's presentation of Sargent, Whistler, and Venetian Glass, American Artist and the Magic of Murano, is generously supported by the Consulate General of Italy in Houston, the Texas Commission on the Arts, and the Alice L. Walton Foundation Temporary Exhibitions Endowment. And a special thanks, Special thanks to the Italy America Chamber of Commerce of Texas for hosting the tasting as part of tonight's second Thursday at the Carter. And additionally, we would like to thank the staff at Hired Hands for providing American Sign Language interpretation for tonight's lecture. Thank you. But tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers. Joining us this evening is the Carter's Curator of Painting, Sculpture, and Works on Paper, Maggie Adler, and our guest tonight, Crawford Alexander Mann III. Alex is Director of Curatorial Affairs and Chief Curator at Telfair Museums in Savannah, Georgia. This recent appointment follows nearly 5 years as Curator of Prints and Drawing at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., where he created the 2021 exhibition and catalog, Sargent, Whistler, and Venetian Glass, American Artists and the Magic of Murano. Prior curatorial service included the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia, and the RISD Museum of Art in Providence, Rhode Island. He holds degrees from Yale University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and has received research fellowships from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Corning Museum of Glass, and other organizations. Mann studies American art within international dialogues and exchanges from neoclassical sculpture and the Grand Tour to 20th century African American and Asian American art. He has developed publications and exhibitions on Raphael, Thomas Cole, Georgia O'Keeffe, Thomas Hart Benton, Chira Obata, and civil rights era photography. After Maggie and Alex's conversation this evening, we will transition into a Q&A with all of you. I will have a microphone for demonstrations. I will have a microphone for audience members to use, and this will be because we are recording tonight's talk. And that way, when we upload this to our YouTube channel, everyone listening will be able to hear your questions. So I think that's all of the business. Please join me in welcoming Maggie Adler and Alex Mann.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to be a little heretical today. My studies of American art occurred at a time when all the professors were saying, well, this is like, Sargent is like Velázquez, only worse. Or Akins is like Jerome, only worse. And so I've made it my mission to see American art outside the context of European art and give it a little bit of a boost. But tonight I'm going to say, and we're going to have a conversation about what's American about American art anyway. What you might not know is that for the basically first 50 or so years of the Carter's history, not only did we only collect American art, but we only collected American art that represented the United States. Unlike museums like the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where, you know, when Thomas Cole went to Italy, there are paintings of Italy. Or when Mary Cassatt went to France, there are paintings of France. We have one of those now. But really, our collection was based on American artists doing American scenes, like this Thomas Moran. What you don't know, or maybe you do if you're very knowledgeable, is that Thomas Moran is not only not really originally American, but he also is very, very influenced by the artist in the center bottom, which is Turner. So there would be no Thomas Moran and no Thomas Moran watercolor technique without Turner. And here, from the exhibition, is Thomas Moran's views of Venice, which I would argue infuse his paintings of scenes of the United States. So is Thomas Moran really solely an American artist? I leave it up to you just to decide. So maybe there's nothing uniquely American about American art. I'm showing you two of the earliest considered heroes of American art, John Singleton Copley, and a representation of Benjamin West and his school in London. These artists were trained in London, and they based their success on whether London audiences really appreciated their work. I always thought it was a big shame that Copley, who had this unique style of his own, was constantly feeling thwarted by the critics of London and saying, oh, his work is too liney, or it looks too strange and too particular. Well, I mean, he was a gorgeous painter. But his background is in copying, right? So he went to Rome, he went to Paris, he went to Florence. He spent a tremendous amount of time at the Vatican. I think you wouldn't have had Benjamin West or Copley become the artists that they were if they hadn't traveled to Italy. Here's John Vanderlyn's Ariadne asleep on the island of Naxos. The story, if you don't know it, is Theseus abandons Ariadne on the island of Naxos, and she becomes the bride of Dionysius. Well, Dionysius is the god of wine. So my professor used to say, she didn't become the bride of Dionysius, she took to the bottle when Theseus left her. Anyway, so this John Vanderlyn's Ariadne is really closely based on Giorgione and Titian, and so again, no John Vanderlyn without Italy. No Thomas Cole, the father of American landscape painting, without trips to Europe. This is not our painting, obviously. You might recognize it from Crystal Bridges, but he was friends with the artist William Cullen Bryant, who encouraged him upon his departure for Europe for the first time to keep that earlier, wilder image bright, to recognize that the landscape was what America had to offer. But of course, Cole is not making landscape that solely looks American, looks like a little bit of European landscape, looks a little bit like Constable. So there's no Cole without Europe. Here's his Course of Empire. There's no Cole without Italy. There's no Cole without the Discobolus. So is there anything really uniquely American about Thomas Cole? This is probably why I study Winslow Homer, because you could make an argument that there's something uniquely American about Winslow Homer, except is there? So the painting Undertow, one could argue, was influenced by the Elgin marbles in England. The Veteran in a New Field was potentially influenced by Millet. So is there any Homer without England or France? The world may never know. He didn't go to Italy. Akins was a student of Gérôme. Is there really swimming from our collection without Gérôme's The Snake Charmer? William Merritt Chase and Duveneck studied in Germany, in Munich. They were influenced by Franz Hals. They were influenced by Courbet. On the left, you see Franz Hals. In the center, you see Chase's own self-portrait. And on the right, you see Duveneck's portrait of Chase from their time studying together in Munich. So would there be any Chase and Duveneck without studying in Europe? I think not. Sargent, the lesser Velázquez, you might say. I don't actually believe this, I'm just playing devil's advocate. But, would there be Sargent's Daughters of Edward Darley-Boyd without Las Meninas? Maybe not. So, hence this show. I don't know if this is what Alex had in mind when he organized the show, but one can argue that we have this show here that is full of Venetian glass and full of scenes of Venice. I hope Ruth Carter Stevenson isn't haunting me. But we have this show here because there would not be the renown and the career-forming experiences that artists like Duveneck and Sargent and Moran had without their travels to Venice, without their experiences of the glass furnaces, without their inspiration from their travels abroad. So this is, I would argue, a moment in which you cannot really understand American art until you understand where these artists were and what they were seeing. And with that, I will turn it over to Alex.
Maggie, thank you, and thank you to Madeline and to Andy and for everyone here at the Amon Carter for organizing this show. It is so much fun to be here. I am also a student of American art from that generation that was trying to decide where the boundaries of American art actually are. And I was someone who always wanted to push those boundaries and to travel myself, but also to think about how travel has always been a part of this history of American art, and then to make that travel happen for all of us through the course of the scholarship that I'm working on. And this has been really special in the past 2 years when I was putting the final touches on this exhibition and trapped in my bedroom. And so I was able to go every single day to my laptop and then through the pictures and the projects and the letters and the stories in this show to travel to Venice. And so for those of you who haven't done much traveling in the past 2 years, I hope you're enjoying this show and getting ready for whatever travels are ahead or enjoying some memories. But for my talk tonight, I wanted to take us into a few of my favorite works from the show and just give us a chance to look as a group more closely. And so for those of you who have not been upstairs, this will be your teaser. And for those of you that have, you can look and enjoy, and then we'll talk about these things individually a little bit more. So I'm going to start by showing you one of my favorite pieces, and this is one of the starting points. People like to ask, where did you get the idea for this show? Where did it all begin? And this is one of those key objects that really set my mind working and set the research going. What in the world is this? What are we looking at here? So I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this image and see if you all can tease out what we're looking at. Looks like we've got a little group of figures over here, some bodies and some arms. Then here in the middle, maybe some people standing, not really sure what they're doing. Someone here hunched over, sitting down, someone standing in front of him. And then over here on the left, looks like a group of people standing. And then, of course, the best part of the whole picture are these crazy hatch marks up in the center of it, where the artist is really just going wild with his stylus. This is a dry point print. It is not an etching. There's no acid involved in this. This is all done with the artist scratching directly on the surface of a copper plate to produce these very fine, somewhat ephemeral lines. And they have a very special quality to the line, and I hope you can see it well here in the blow-up, that the lines have a little bit of a fuzzy edge to them that really gives an extra kind of mistiness to the lines in a dry point. This is a relatively ephemeral print also in that the lines of a dry point are not as deep. So when the printer is producing these on the press, you cannot get as many impressions. And maybe that's the reason that there are only 7 known impressions of this particular print. So I feel like we're all really lucky to have been able to borrow one from the New York Public Library to show in this exhibition that you'll see upstairs. Now, the early critics of this print were also a little confused by what this was. So I'm sharing with you one of the critical responses. It was written in the newspaper when this was first exhibited, quote, "It skillfully avoids any infringement of the commandment against making images of any objects known to man." Vaguely, one discerns some oblong things, some bristly things of unfamiliar character. This is by James Whistler, and Whistler was used to this criticism. I'm showing you here self-portrait by Whistler from a few years earlier, arrangement in gray. We all know Whistler from his portrait of his mother, arrangement in black and gray, number 1. Whistler's very fond as much of composing his shapes and his colors on the canvas, and I would argue also composing his pockets of lines and his sketchy little bristly things in his prints, as he was of actually giving us information. And this resulted in frequent criticism long before this comment about his print here of the glass furnace. He had produced in 1875 Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket, which the art critic John Ruskin said was a complete insult to the public because the painting was so unclear in what the details, what the image actually is. Ruskin said that Whistler had thrown a pot of paint into the face of the public with this picture. Now, Whistler loved attention, and so he was probably quite happy to get this criticism in some ways because it allowed him to sue Ruskin for libel in court and generate a lot of extra media attention. And, of course, many of the critics were very harsh, and they said that Whistler worked too fast. And here's a cartoon from the time period that suggests Whistler's painting 3 pictures at once and completely cheating in terms of art and in terms of the workload that he's giving us as an artist. But in the end, Mr. Whistler did win his lawsuit. However, the cost of court bankrupted him, and he wound up in 1879 with no money and needing a new project. And so he goes to Venice and stays there for 14 months and produces a wonderful group of etchings of dry points, pastels, watercolors, and a few paintings. One of the most productive moments in his career, maybe because he wasn't talking to the newspapers for a few days. He got some work done, but comes back with this wonderful collection of images of Venice, never goes back to Venice again for the rest of his career, and yet Venice remains something that we very much associate with Whistler because of the variety and the beauty of the work that he did during this time period, including pieces like this print in which he's taking us inside one of the glass furnaces on the island of Murano. So here, this got me thinking, what is Whistler doing over on Murano in this time period? It's easy for us to understand why he's doing images of the Grand Canal and of the Piazza of San Marco and the normal tourist attractions, things that had been common subjects for artists in the past. But glass furnaces, especially something like this, where we can't even really tell what's going on, what is it for Whistler that attracts him to this space? So we'll compare it here for a moment with an image of a glass furnace that's a little more easy to read. This is sort of a postcard that is inviting you, if you were a tourist in this time period, staying in Venice, to go over to Murano and to tour some of these glass furnaces, an experience that we could have today, clearly available 150 years ago. Nothing has changed in Venice in a lot of ways. But if we look closely at the postcard view, we can see some of these same figures, and we recognize that Whistler's glass worker hunched over the bench, spinning the piece on the rod, is doing the exact same action that we see the glassblower doing on the postcard in the much clearer view. And here we can zoom in. And in some ways, I think that Whistler is actually giving us a more accurate view than we see on the postcard, because if you can imagine, the actual glass blowers on Murano would not have been dressed up in these fancy vests. It would have been so miserably hot and steamy and gross in the glass furnace that everything on this postcard is completely sanitized. And in this way, I think Whistler has given us a view, an impression, an experience of being inside the glass furnace as a tourist that is far more accurate than what we're getting in the postcard view. Because Whistler would have understood how difficult it is when you were inside this dark space to actually see what is going on, and how much smoke would have been coming up from the furnaces. And so maybe he really couldn't see much more than what we're seeing in the print in the end. However, I like the print because it's showing us the final products of the glass industry, which were what drew the tourist over there to Murano. This is what they wanted to see being made. How were the artisans of Murano producing objects like this vase with the dolphin and serpent here? This is what the island of Murano became famous for in this moment, producing very fine works of glass that were so sophisticated, so complicated, so sculptural in terms of their adornments, so fragile that you would not have actually wanted to use this for a vase or a ewer of any kind. You would have wanted to put this in a cupboard, put it up on your mantle, put it in the center of the table, but only to point to your friends and show off how beautiful it was and how proud you were to own such a very fine work of art that happened to be made not of paint, but of glass. So Murano, I will remind you, is this little island just to the north of the main complex of islands. And Venice, this is a map from about 1872, and we can see Murano highlighted up there. And Murano had been center of Venice's glassmaking industry for centuries. They had been making glass on Murano in the late Middle Ages, and by the medieval and Renaissance and Baroque periods, when Venetian wealth was at its peak, as we see in this image from Canaletto, the glass industry on Murano was thriving, and Venice was producing the finest, the clearest, the most beautiful, the most sophisticated glass in all of Europe. This painting, by the way, is from the Kimball next door, borrowing a little bit of their collection to support us here. And continuing with that theme, some examples of the fine art that was produced in Venice during its Renaissance and Baroque heyday. Beautiful Bellini, Madonna and Child here. And you can imagine the Venetians using all of this wealth from their trading and their banking and their manufacturing empires to decorate their palaces and their churches with fine frescoes and murals like the Tiepolo. And this is another study from the Kimball next door here, Coronation of the Virgin. But all of this wealth and artistic sophistication and flourishing productivity that was going on in Venice in the Renaissance and through the 17th and 18th centuries came to a crashing halt. And here's a few examples of the glass that was coming out of the Renaissance. I'll show you as well. And one piece from the show upstairs, just for comparison. And I love this piece included in here because I think you can see some of the same attention for the gold and the colors that maintains over time, and it's reflected also in the painting, so some stylistic correspondence. But to jump back into our history lesson, we have Venice, powerful, strong, queen of the Adriatic, and this ends very suddenly in the late 18th century with Napoleon's conquest of Europe. Venice's territory all around the Mediterranean disappears, and then Venice loses its own autonomy, first to the French, and then to the Austrians through the first half of the 19th century. And so this is a moment of economic stagnation. Most of the glass furnaces close. Tourism declines. Venice is not a fun place to spend time. Taxes are very high. There is censorship on the media. The economy is almost dead until the era of the Risorgimento. So in the mid-19th century, there are a series of wars throughout Italy as the Italians expel the foreign powers, unite the different areas of the Italian peninsula into a single nation state, a constitutional monarchy, which Venice joins in 1866. So this is a moment of decline and then rebirth with Italian unification. And Venice, as they're coming out of this moment of economic collapse, has a major stimulus package in a way of public infrastructure projects. So you have the first bridge to the mainland in 1846, connecting Venice by rail. And then if you look more closely here on our map, we'll see in 1872 some of the evidence of these changes underway. We have an iron girder bridge across the Grand Canal that was new in 1854. Those of you who have been to Venice are kind of scratching your heads and saying, where is this? This was very much admired when they first built it. An iron bridge is a symbol of progress. And by the 1930s, it looked a little bit too new. So they put in something with a little bit more historical character and took down that one. But you can see here also the expanded port, no cruise ships yet at that time period. But we do have a steamship coming over. You can see the little steam pipe there with smoke coming out of it and the paddle wheel on the back that, of course, was making Venice even more accessible than ever before to travelers from across the Atlantic coming in. So meanwhile, over on Murano, the exact same thing is happening. Venice is part of United Italy. The economy's bouncing back, and the island of Murano says, oh, we need to restart our glass furnaces and recapture this crown of glassmaking excellence that the city had had in centuries past. This is all led by a gentleman named Antonio Salviati. And the Salviati companies are responsible for many of the glassworks that you see upstairs in the show. Salviati was not a glassmaker at all. He was a lawyer who became a businessman. Don't ever let anyone tell you that he blew a piece of glass. I'm not sure if he ever blew anything in his life, but he was a very excellent businessman and promoter and spokesperson and lover of the arts and supporter of these efforts for Venice to use the arts as a way to not only save and restore the economy, but also restore their pride and international reputation. And so the first element of glass that Salviati invests in when he's restarting the furnaces is glass mosaics. The city itself was restoring its old churches, fixing the mosaics that were falling down on San Marco and other churches around the city, and they needed glass tiles in order to do this. And so by restarting the glass furnaces, Salviati was able to supply them with the raw materials for that, and then to promote mosaic decorations as something that was beautiful and appropriate for public buildings, such that subsequently his firms were producing mosaic tile decorations for major new public projects in Berlin, in Paris, in London, in the United States. You can find Salviati mosaics in Boston, New York, Chicago, in the Bay Area. The campus of Stanford University is covered in Venetian glass mosaics done by this firm, and we have a fragment of that upstairs in the show. But subsequently, Salviati turns his attention to blown glass, to the fine pieces of luxury tableware that the island had been so famous for in centuries past. And so I'm showing you just the range, the variety of some of the pieces that we have in the show so that you can appreciate the beauty, the complexity, the sophistication, all of the different techniques. Both the colors and the clarity and the transparency were equally important to what made Venetian glass distinctive. So many different signature elements that these artists might combine or use or focus on, but in every case, works that were meant to be looked at and not used. And I think the piece with the spiny stem there in the center says it better than any of them. It's basically saying, you cannot pick me up because I will poke holes into your hand. It's telling you that I am only there to be looked at and admired from a distance. And these were exactly the pieces that Americans were collecting. Some of these pieces were direct historical replicas. The artisans working in the factories on Murano were looking at art history textbooks that were showing them images of glass from the Renaissance and Baroque era and making exact copies so that they could say, oh, we in the late 1800s can blow glass just as well as our ancestors on Murano were doing several hundred years before. And then they said, well, we can do it just as well, but we can also do it better. And so at the same time, they were experimenting, adding new things. Basically, there was no limit to the level of creativity and difficulty and complexity that, in the eyes of the Venetians and their clients, was regarded as good in this time period. It was always, how can we take it to the next level? How can we invent a new color? What else can we add to this piece to make it more special? What else can we bring into this individual object that no other glassmaker in any other city in the world is going to dare to do? So zooming in on this one particular goblet, I love this one because it does have such a hodgepodge of different techniques. And you can see it's got these sculptural swans that are done in flame working of twirling glass that itself has ridges and textures, and then you have this sort of candy cane S in the center. And then if you look really closely at the colors on that, you'll see it's actually two different colors. It's a red and then a band of sort of copper-flecked aventurine glass intermixed. That's a signature Venetian formula that they guarded very closely here. And then if we look at the top, that pattern is called Fenicio, and it's when the striped glass has been brushed in one of the final stages with sort of a comb feature in order to create this feathery design, doing as many different things as they can think of, such that no two piece is identical. And of course, we know that anyway, because glass is hand-blown. So even if they were repeating some of these designs over and over, the individuality of the pieces was very important to the glassmakers and to their clients. This is very much a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. As a collector, people wanted things that were not made in the factory, things that really showed the hand, the mind, the imagination of the artisan, as much as you would find in a painting. A piece of Venetian glass carried some little spark of the genius of the glassmaker through its individuality. And as a collector, you could point to those elements as you showed a piece of this off to one of your friends in your home. So Salviati was an excellent spokesperson. He articulated all of this when explaining to clients why they needed to be collecting Venetian glass, and won international awards at World's Fairs, opened showrooms in London and New York, and the press covered these, the press illustrated his work, and here you can see some period newspapers and magazines, Harper's Weekly, Peterson's, sort of a ladies' home journal of the time, and some of the exact pieces that we have in the show as shown in these accounts, so that we know that there were more than one of these made. These are designs that are repeated with small differences. We can't tell you how many. They're not signed. They're not editioned. But this is how we identify which of the different Venetian glassmaking firms it might have come from, based on ads and on newspapers from the time period. The pinnacle of their glassmaking, the sort of grand triumph, is this piece. We call it the Guggenheim Cup. This is an historical replica. This is a copy of a 17th century glass vessel, 26 inches tall. That would be about here or so. Picture that in your minds, or go upstairs and look at the Guggenheim Cup that we have. The original Guggenheim Cup, the 17th century one, was in a private collection in Venice, and it was greatly admired by all the glassmakers, but they all said, this is too hard. No one can do this. This is beyond the powers of any of us, even the finest of the folks in the 19th century, until a 16-year-old kid who was an apprentice in the glassmaking firm, Giuseppe Barovier, did and successfully completed a copy of the Guggenheim Cup. And as soon as he pulled it off, his best friend, Isidoro Seguso, from a rival historical glassmaking family, said, well, if he did it, I can do it too. And so it sort of became a thing for all of the Venetian glassmakers to try to copy the Guggenheim Cup as sort of the ultimate testament that you really had achieved the pinnacle of skill. And I'm so happy that we were able to include one of these in the exhibition, that you get to see one upstairs, because they really are remarkable. This sort of three-tiered scaffold. And if you go look at it, there is no single solid stem in the middle. It sort of comes around and back together. It's a really kind of feat of physics and engineering in its own way. Here you see a Guggenheim Cup from the Museo del Vetro on Murano, so another example of that, with minor differences, of course, but repeating this overall structure and style. And here are a few more pieces from the exhibition, just to show you the variety, the creativity. Really love this vase in the shape of a fish. That does not have any historical precedent, something that they totally made up, completely one of a kind there. And then we've got some wonderful arrangements. This is installation photos from the previous presentation of the exhibition at the Smithsonian, and you can see upstairs more cases that put all this together. And a few more of my favorites here. So the exhibition and catalog, by the way, are going to be here until September, as you well know, so bring your friends, come back, spend some more time with it, and if you need to see it more beyond that, just a plug, it is going next, third and final venue, to the Mystic Seaport Museum in Mystic, Connecticut. So if you have friends in New England who are fans of Sargent or Whistler or Venetian Glass, tell them to come and see us in Connecticut this coming winter. But I want to go back to the fine artist that are in the title of the show and around the walls. Are they our supporting characters, or is the glass? I'm not really sure as we go around the show. And so to look a little bit further at Sargent and at Whistler. And we have some wonderful Sargent views of Venice in the exhibition. Here's the corner of the Church of St. Stai, where you can see him outdoors, studying the facade of this church and capturing the sunlight and the change of colors and the harsh, kind of beautiful midday sun and what that brings out here. But we also think of Sargent as a portrait painter, and we have some wonderful images of figures in the show as well. And so I want to do a little bit of a comparison between what is probably Sargent's most famous portrait, Madame X, from the Metropolitan Museum's collection. This is a portrait of the American socialite living in Paris, Amélie Gautreau. And I want to compare this picture, Madame X, from 1883-84 with the Venetian Woman that you see upstairs that was done in 1882, just 1 year earlier, and these are about the same size. And I think they have a lot in common. It would be really hard to bring Madame X for this, but you might have something that is just as good. So everyone raves, and I just love, probably one of the best moments in all of American art is her hand and the way it's reaching down and clutching the edge of her dress here. And then when you look at the Venetian Woman, you have, again, Sargent's understanding of anatomy and also the way he is capturing this sense of touch and tactility and the way she is pulling the volume of the dress and the fabric between her fingers, and how easy it is for us to imagine that, looking at either of these two paintings. And then, of course, two wonderful, beautiful faces here. Madame X, this, of course, was a portrait of someone who Sargent knew. And in the case of the Italian, or the Venetian Woman, Sargent is working with a model. It may be a woman named Gigi Viani, who is recorded in some of the journals as one of his Venetian models. We're not really sure, but I think there's so much between them that I want to call this one Madame V, an acknowledgement, maybe, of their similarities. But the real reason this is in the show is because of this blue thing in her arms, something that looks a bit like a fan, but this is in fact not a fan. This is a bundle of glass rods that are a middle stage in the process of making beads. So she is a sorter of glass rods that are then going to be cut into individual beads and polished as a middle step in the production of glass beads, which were one of the important products of the glass furnaces on Murano, alongside the works of fine art glass, the blown vessels that we've been looking at, and the mosaics that we've seen already. So many different types of glass coming out of Murano in this time period. And here are the beautiful colors and the patterns. And I want you to look closely at the beads when you go upstairs into the show, because I think we see the same level of variety and experimentation and complexity happening in the Venetian bead industry that we see in every element of glassmaking that is going on in the island at that time, and also an awareness that their beads were going abroad. So the set of beads that you're seeing upstairs are on sample cards. These are made for the bead merchants to bring abroad and then sell the beads in bulk to clients in North America. That's why the cards say Venice and New York. They're put together for export. And of course, the American flag pattern beads here that were developed in acknowledgement that the United States had already become a major export market for Venetian beads by the time these sample cards were made around the year 1900. And here are a few more views of the display of the bead cards that we have upstairs. So when Sargent is painting his Venetian Woman, he is basically responding to how prevalent, how visible the glassmaking industry was around the island at that time period. And we see this in Whistler's work as well. Whistler is also using bead workers as his models, or they are appearing as the stoppage figures in many of his views of Venice. So his image of old women here, another dry point, this hunched over figure here in the doorway of a shop or a house. She is not sewing. She is leaning over a tray stringing beads. And here is a period photograph so that you will believe me when I tell you this. This was a very common sight if you had been a tourist or an artist working in Venice. In doorways all throughout the city, women were employed to string and divide the beads. They had to string them in strands of equal weight so that they could be sold, and that was how the pricing system worked. So not in bags, but in strands was the final step in the process before they would go to market. So we have Sargent looking at the bead workers here, and Whistler as well. And here's a trio of Sargent sort of putting together what's happening in his career beyond Venice. We've got just before, image of a Spanish dancer, Venetian Woman, and Madame X right after. And then, of course, he moves on to become the great society portraitist of his era. And I'll bring us through here Lady Helen Vincent and Madame Davis, Mrs. Davis and her son in the 1890s. Excuse me. And then your two Sargents upstairs. And I think we have a fun comparison here between Alice Vanderbilt Shepherd, more conventional portrait by Sargent, and then his image of Edwin Booth, which I think has something more of the character of the bead stringer, the bead sorter, not only in the size and scale of the picture, but I think that Sargent probably saw something of a level of artistic identification, both with Booth and with the figures, the dancers, the bead stringers that he is depicting earlier. A sense of shared creativity and participation in the arts. And I think this is something, a level of respect, that Whistler would have had as well when he is in the glass furnaces at Murano and watching the glassmakers, the glass blowers at work. The most visible figure within this figure hunched over, is a figure who would have been understood to be a worker in the fine arts, just like Whistler himself. And if we need any final evidence of that, we can look over at the group of figures on the left side of the painting. And if you zoom in on this, I am pretty sure that that is a self-portrait of Whistler that he has included, which I think is a kind of fascinating moment of humility for an artist who was notoriously a self-promoter, to put himself here as a spectator rather than as the artist. And I think this really just says it all for the level of respect that Venetian glass had in the late 19th century and what it has earned for me in the course of doing this project. So thank you all for bringing it here to Fort Worth.
Thank you, Alex. Ooh, that's loud. Do we need to turn it down a little bit? Okay, I'll try to speak more softly, which is impossible for me. But anyway, I wanted to start it off with a question. More so than any other exhibition that we've done, people have been asking how the heck you found all these objects, particularly the sample cards, the glass. We know where to find paintings, but did you just Google Venice, 19th century, and start there? Talk a little bit about your process.
As with every show, it just takes a lot of research, and this was almost 8 years in the making. So something that started out as a small idea, just collecting images, collecting ideas in a little folder in a drawer, grew over time, and then a lot was conversations and help from other people. So sharing with curators, folks like Maggie at other institutions about the project and saying, what ideas do you have? Are there paintings? Are there objects that I need to know about? And all of the glass in the show is from period collections. So that is to say, it is all glass that was purchased and brought over to the United States in the late 19th or early 20th century, and we know that because it was then donated to museums. So that all has a chain of provenance. So in that case, I went to the databases of the oldest museums in the United States and looked to see if they had Venetian glass.
One of the most interesting stories, I think, for me is the story of the Stanfords. And even I think people who are associated with Stanford University don't realize the Venetian history of their lives. And so could you sort of give a little preview of what people will see upstairs?
Stanford University and the Stanford family have a large presence within the show, and I was fortunate to do a research trip out there to explore this, but Stanford has the largest collection of Venetian glass outside of Venice, between the mosaic decorations on Stanford University's chapel and the Venetian glass that they have in the art museum on campus at Stanford University. And in short, that happened because the Stanford family were traveling in Italy at the time of the death of their son Leland Jr. And when he passed away as a teenager, the family had been to Venice, and they were assisted by one of the head officials in one of the Venetian glassmaking firms with the logistics of dealing with the death of their son while they were abroad. So what had been a professional interest in Venetian glass as art collectors and art lovers developed into a friendship with the glassmaking firm. And so when the family later decided to build a university in California, they contracted with the Venetians in order to decorate that. And that also led to a major collection of Venetian glass coming to California as well. And to me, that was fascinating to think about Venetian glass and projects winding up across the United States from coast to coast. How far is California from Venice in this time period, and yet how much glass made it there?
It's fascinating. So for the amount of time that the show has been here, I've been fascinated with the process of glass blowing and kind of tempted to try it myself. So how did you come upon your knowledge of glass blowing techniques? We added an interpretive station for all of us who have not blown glass to understand how cane is made, but this is sort of outside the realm of a normal American art curator's provenance, so to say.
Yeah, I had the privilege of working previously at the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, Virginia, which has a very large collection of glass and also a curator of glass. And so that's another element in the origin of this, is interacting with that collection, interacting with the glass blowers who are working in the hot shop that they have there on the campus of the museum. And so through those folks, I learned a lot about glass making, and they helped me understand how to see and talk about glass and recognize the different techniques. Even though I do not blow glass myself, I've tried it a couple of times, but again, that was through working with actual artists and showing these pieces. As we wrote the labels for the pieces, I showed them to glass curators and glass artists and said, can you help me list the different techniques that were used to make this? And we puzzled over them together in order to understand how they were made. And some of them are a little bit of a mystery. And how did they get that piece there, and what was the process behind them? And it really helps you appreciate their creativity and the sophistication and complexity in many of these pieces.
There's another star of the show. So when you look at the wall that we've put up of Sargent, bead stringers and beads and cane sorters, there are also the women of Murano and their lace making. So should we give a little bit of a shout out to the lace making process and what you learned about Murano?
I couldn't resist, because the Venetian glass revival spawned a recognition that glass was not the only thing that Venice had been very, very good at making in centuries past. And Venice was also famous for its Murano lace historically, and the story is basically the same. The lace-making industry on the adjacent island of Murano, so slightly further away, had gone dormant, and after the success of the glass revival, the Venetians on Murano reopened their lace school, in essence, in order to teach young women and restart all at once in 1872 lace making on Murano. And so basically taking the pattern of the glass revival and applying it to another industry. So we have some examples of Murano lace from the period upstairs in the exhibition in recognition of that, as well as I was really excited to find some evidence that the Venetian glassmakers were using lace patterns on the glass. And so the two different craft industries influencing each other. And I have my little piece of Murano lace that I've been using as a pocket square throughout this exhibition that I got when I was over on Murano doing research. But it's sort of fun to connect all of these different things. I can't really wear a glass pocket square that much.
I probably should know the answer to this question, but Venice for Americans is so and for British people is so associated with John Ruskin. And so how did Whistler navigate the kind of association with Ruskin after he's just completed this lawsuit?
Exactly. Ruskin had written a set of books, The Stones of Venice, that were sort of a history of Venetian architecture and design that had been published about 2 decades before the Ruskin-Whistler trial. And they're part of the influence on the return of tourism to Venice, the interest of the Venetians in restoring their own churches is coming in many degrees out of what Ruskin has written praising Venetian architecture from the past. And so when Americans, including Sargent and Whistler, are experiencing Venice, their appreciation for Venetian architecture and Venetian history is definitely fed by this general Anglophone cultural appreciation for Venice that has come out of Ruskin. And I think it really is the same interest in a lot of ways. And so I think it's fun to think about how Whistler and Ruskin in the courtroom are antagonists, but actually if they had been quizzed on what they saw and appreciated about Venice, their terms would have been quite the same.
Yeah, I always find it interesting how much a fan of Turner Ruskin was, and yet he couldn't tolerate the abstraction of Whistler.
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of contradictions in Ruskin that if you read, and that's, I think, what happens in some ways. If you continue writing art criticism over decades and decades, sooner or later your opinions are going to change. And the same for artists whose styles evolve over time.
Should we open it up to the crowd? Yeah, okay. Madeline is going to come around with a microphone. Again, because we're recording, if you would wait for her presence, that would be great.
So does anybody have any questions? Ooh, one right in second row.
Alex, how many times did you look at that Whistler dry point before you pegged the self-portrait?
That did actually come quite late in the process. Because the picture was already of the glass furnaces, I will confess that I put it on the checklist for the show and plowed on with my research. And that just, I think, shows the rewards of actually looking at the objects later and not just enjoying the big picture. The object always has something new to say to you when you study every inch of it. And that could be said for many of the works in this. And is the reason why we should keep coming back to museums and keep looking, because there are a lot of discoveries waiting for us.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to go back in history a little bit. So, clearly, Venice and Murano were very involved in you're going back many centuries in the beautiful glass. But what was it that brought that glass to Venice, to Murano?
Glassmaking had developed on the Venetian islands as early as the city itself had been settled, and there is evidence of glass having been made there in the 400s and 500s, which is about the time that the first settlements were happening there. So it's something that had always had a history and a presence, documented to different degrees. So not necessarily on Murano, but in the 1200s, the city of Venice actually decreed that all of the glassmaking furnaces, which had been scattered throughout the islands, be centralized only on the island of Murano, so that they were no longer scattered all throughout the islands. And this was ostensibly in order to prevent fires by having all of these furnaces in one place. But the secondary reason for that was also so that Venice could have a monopoly on the glassmaking industry and essentially trap all of these expert artisans with their knowledge of specialized glass formulas and expert techniques in glassmaking in this one place. And the glassmakers were not allowed to travel abroad. And you could not potentially leave and go to Paris or Vienna to work, or the Venetian government would send an assassin after you.
Correct.
Yes, it was a very tightly controlled industry. So the glassmakers on Murano earned a great deal of money, and they were given special privileges to marry into the nobility. And there is a called the Book of Gold, the Libro d'Oro, that records the names of all of the historical glassmaking families because of the respect that they were given. But it was also well known that the city was attempting to control and profit off of this expertise at the same time.
And the book does a really good job of explaining that during the Risorgimento, the people who were members of those historical Murano families, even if they weren't trained in the art of glass, were the natural choices to revive the art because there was something kind of inherently genetic about their capabilities.
Right, and the glassmaking families that are running the major studios that you visit on Murano today are the same families and generations that were working on these pieces in the late 1800s. They can trace their roots as glassmakers back to the Renaissance or earlier. Many of them, yes. So you can go and buy contemporary Seguso. You can see Seguso upstairs in the show, and we know that they've been making glass for hundreds of years before that.
I'm coming up here. Oh, thanks.
It's kind of a corollary thought. Considering how delicate these pieces are, can you talk to traveling the pieces back in that period? Everything had to come by sea. There was no air freight back then.
So this was something that kind of frightened me in the course of organizing this show. Would museums allow us to borrow and travel the glass today, given how delicate the pieces are? And yes, many did. No, some did not. There were some pieces that I asked to borrow that were deemed too fragile to come here and be part of this exhibition. And I said, I completely understand. And other places said, well, it's very, very fragile, but also this is an important story that hasn't been told. We do want our collection to be a part of that. So very grateful to all of the institutions that loaned to this. But my understanding is that this anxiety has always been present. And in the 19th century, when glass was shipped from Italy to North America, pieces were broken, and sometimes folks were disappointed. But many, many pieces, as we can see, arrived because every piece of glass in the show upstairs came to North America at least before the 1930s, and some of those pieces in the 1880s came across the Atlantic. And I believe they packed it, my understanding is, in crates with wood chips. So 19th century version of, packing peanuts. I think that was the most common method used.
We have time for another question if there is one. Oh, great.
I'm curious to know if some of pieces were commissioned by the noble, or was the design strictly from the artist's perspective?
That's a really good question. I think in earlier times, there were probably large sets that were commissions. But I don't know if the maker would necessarily have had a lot of say in the design. Now, by the time of the 19th century, there may have been some orders for specific types or groups of things, but because these are not meant to be used, my imagination is that far more often it would have been individual pieces that you are choosing out of a catalog. Now, if you wanted a chandelier, or a mosaic, that would definitely have been a commission. But for the individual pieces of blown glass, the fine art glass that you see, vetri artistici or vetri Salviati, they would have called it blown glass. Those would have been more like shopping from pieces that had already been made. Now, if a certain design was selling well, they would have made more of those and had more of them available. So it was more, I think, responding to demand than on commission.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, thank you all for staying for the talk, and you've got about another hour before the museum closes. Thank you, Maggie and Alex.